So why didn't Kronos raise Medusa to fight by his side during the Battle of Manhattan? The Court of the Dead confirmed that various monsters and entities can be raised from Tartarus by external forces, and this is actually a huge part of why monsters behave the way that they do. Assyrian says that when he or one of his friends is raised by a patron, that they are bound to their service, at least to some extent. Ariel the Empusa outright says that she was raised by Kronos and Gaia, and that several of her kind were strong-armed into doing their bidding, which confirms that Kronos can and has raised monsters from Tartarus. This is how he built up his army. Which then begs the question, why didn't Kronos raise Medusa from Tartarus and use her as an absolute game changer in the war? After all, she could have single-handedly stalled dozens of demigods just by standing somewhere up high and stoning anyone who happened to look at her. Even if she did end up dying, her ratio of demigods incapacitated would have been higher than just about anyone else, probably even the Minotaur. Her presence would have been a monumental problem, yet Kronos himself laments that sadly she hasn't risen yet, implying that he doesn't have the power to raise her even though he was able to raise Empusae and the Minotaur. So why was this? Well, that's what we want to dive into today. In Tartarus, we learn that there are several stages to the regeneration process, and it begins when a monster's essences are collected into regeneration pods, which are rancid cysts that put the monster back together in a gross blistery sack. When Percy and Annabeth are in Tartarus, they encounter a few, and Bob even kills a regenerating Hyperion. And later, this is how Nyx attempts to reset Bob back to his Ieptis identity. She traps him in a regeneration pod and keeps resetting him over and over again until his quote-unquote true form emerges, and he regains all of his memories and the personality of Ieptis. Right now, we don't get a strong sense of how long one of these regeneration pods takes to reassemble a monster, but it's possible that it varies based on a variety of different factors. We know that Hyperion was able to regenerate before the end of House of Hades, and that Bob was able to go through multiple regenerations within a span of a few months. But Chiron and Annabeth also talk about how some monsters might stay dead for centuries, so it really just depends on individual circumstances. What's also important to remember, though, is that it's not the end of the process. There are monsters roaming Tartarus freely, searching for a way out. There is an entire ecosystem within the pit that is populated by fully regenerated monsters who are just waiting for an escape, which we know is nearly impossible. So far, the only ways that we know to get out of the pit are the Doors of Death and the Loop of the Five Rivers that eventually goes back up to the underworld. But this idea of a patron might be the third option specifically for monsters. We believe that patrons can raise monsters who have already fully regenerated, but haven't found a way out of Tartarus yet. Sort of like playing a claw machine game to pluck them out of the pit and return them to the surface world. But it doesn't seem like this extends to accelerating the actual regeneration process. While a monster is still in a pod, it's anyone's guess regarding how long it takes for their essence to be stitched back together. And right now, we don't really know what kinds of variables affect this process more heavily than others. It's important to note that Medusa is addressed in The Last Olympian, and Kronos makes it sound like she had regenerated at her own pace, which leads us to believe that he can raise monsters who have already regenerated but haven't clawed their way out of the pit. After all, this seems to be what happened to Kronos himself when Luke started working on ways to raise Titans. It was Luke who had to pull Kronos' essence out of the pit and consolidate it into the sarcophagus, proving that there is a way to basically cast a net into Tartarus and pull something out. It just took Luke a long time since he's only a demigod and isn't comparable in power to someone like Kronos or Gaia. It also makes us wonder if there was a way for the rest of the Argo too to essentially raise Percy and Annabeth with some sort of ritual that could summon them back from the pit. Obviously, this wouldn't have been a good long-term solution since the doors needed to be closed from both sides, but it does leave the question open. It also makes us wonder if Percy and Annabeth could have cut the chains and closed the doors, but what if they didn't ride up? Could this have been an alternative? This is getting a bit off track, but the point we're trying to make is that Medusa is probably still stuck in a regeneration pod somewhere and simply hasn't been reassembled all the way. We don't know why she's taking so much longer than the other monsters, but based off of what we know of the series, it could very well be centuries before she claws her way out again. And even when she does, she still needs to find a way out of Tartarus. It's also important to note that the implication is that even for entities like the Titans and the Primordials, it's a relatively slow or cumbersome process to pull someone out of the pit, since Gaia opted to chain the Doors of Death rather than continue to raise her preferred monsters and minions. If she could just reach down and pluck out whoever she wanted, then she wouldn't need to chain the Doors of Death. So even though these kinds of entities are insanely powerful, they still have limitations. Right now, it doesn't seem like there's a monster who's been dead longer than Medusa, even though whether she is a monster or not is up for debate. Presumably, she regenerates in Tartarus since she dissolved into dust just like we see from other monsters, and we know she's been killed before. Satyrs get reincarnated as an aspect of nature, demigods go to the underworld, and gods, as far as we know, can only die by fading, and that's permanent. Therefore, whether or not we consider Medusa to be a monster, the evidence suggests that she regenerates through Tartarus, since we don't see any other reasonable option for where she would go. Before I do the last paragraph, I have an idea of what causes the variable of time. So, using Iaptis regenerating multiple times in multiple months, I think part of it has to do with proximity to the pit. That is very close to proximity to the pit. And then he's actually re-dying in the pit with Nyx in the regeneration pod. So it could be that it is very, very quickly happening because his proximity to the pit when he died. The other alternative is time out of the pit. So we know Medusa was out of, like, had been alive in the mortal world for a significant amount of time, based off of Antiem's garden. All of the different satyrs that had been turned to stone, Uncle Ferdinand being turned to stone, and him having gone missing, what, like 40 years prior or something like that? She had been active for a while, flying under the radar. So if she lived for, because like monsters can only die from, my light got brighter for some reason. Monsters can only die when they're killed versus like dying of old age. The longer their lifespan, maybe the longer then takes for them to regenerate. It would also explain why it took Kronos millennia to regenerate, because he lived for quite a long time before killing Uranus and then being killed himself. So that might also be part of it. But yeah, I think time alive and proximity to the pit are factors that probably affect how long it takes them to regenerate. Because we don't know how long the Minotaur has been around before Percy kills him in The Lightning Thief. But he's back by the Battle of Manhattan. So I think it probably hasn't been that long. We also know that the Minotaur was going after Percy for the purpose of Hades thought that he had taken the bolt. So in the idea of, you know, pulling them up from the pit, if Hades is the one that pulled the Minotaur up from the pit, like, hey, you've regenerated, I'm pulling you out, go after this demigod. I don't know if that's touched on by Asterion in Court of the Dead, but he could literally have only been alive for a very short period of time, and so then he regenerates quickly in the pit, then Kronos yanks him out again. That's why I think we maybe see him regenerate. And even then, like, if he was plucked out right before the Battle of Manhattan, dies, he's back again by Court of the Dead. It could explain why we see him get regenerated twice in, you know, 12 books. I wasn't including Trials of Apollo, so 17 books versus Medusa being there in the first book and not being back since. That could be a factor. But that's our take on where Medusa is and why she hasn't regenerated yet. But what do you guys think? Do you think this fully explains why Kronos didn't raise her, even though the Court of the Dead made it clear that monsters could be raised from Tartarus? When and where do you think we might see Medusa again? Or is she going to remain dead long beyond Percy and Annabeth's lifetimes? As always, we love this series, we love talking about this series, and we'd love to have you join in on the conversation down below. Take care, friends, don't text on your Pegasus, and we'll see you in the next one.